In the autumn of 1943, on a humid, battle-scarred airfield in Rabaul, an intelligence report made the rounds among Japan's elite naval aviators. It described a new American fighter, a powerful, heavy aircraft. The Americans called it the Hellcat. One of the men who read that report was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest living aces. A year earlier, over Guadalcanal, enemy fire had ripped through his cockpit, leaving him severely wounded. A bullet had grazed his skull, and shattered glass had destroyed his right eye. In what was considered a miracle of airmanship, he flew his damaged Zero fighter for nearly 5 hours, over 560 nautical miles, blind in one eye, and brought it home. Now, serving as a trainer, his one good eye scanned the specifications of this new American machine, and he laughed. He wasn't alone. To the proud pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the undisputed masters of the sky, the report seemed like a miscalculation. They saw the Hellcat, weighing nearly twice as much as their beloved A6M0, as a clumsy machine. They saw it as more of the same flawed American thinking, trying to replace pure pilot skill with heavy machinery. Through the tent flaps, Sakai could see the sleek, beautiful Zeros that had given Japan air superiority for 2 long years. They were nimble, elegant, and effective, the steel embodiment of the samurai spirit. This new American plane, this Hellcat, would be just another easy target. What Sakai and his comrades couldn't possibly know was that the laughter in that tent was a prelude to a dramatic shift in the Pacific Air War. They laughed at the Hellcat because they didn't understand its purpose. They believed air combat was a duel, an art form. The Americans were about to teach them it was an industry. The Hellcat wasn't a duelist, it was a systematic warplane. This is the story of how that laughter turned to concern, how a plane initially mocked for its weight achieved a staggering victory ratio, and how it systematically overwhelmed an empire's air force, one engagement at a time. To understand the arrogance of that laughter, you have to understand the impact of the Zero. In the opening year of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was a tremendous challenge for Allied pilots. It arrived in the skies as a formidable opponent, a fighter so far beyond what the Allies had that it felt almost mythical. It was an agile aircraft in a ring full of relatively less maneuverable rivals. With its low weight, it could outturn anything the Americans or British could field. The P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo, one by one, they faced the challenge of the Zero's incredible agility and the superb skill of its pilots. And these weren't just any pilots. They were trained in the world's most rigorous naval aviation program. An average Japanese naval aviator in 1941 had over 700 hours of flight time, much of it honed in the skies over China. They were a warrior elite, steeped in the spirit of Bushido. They saw air combat not just as a tactical exercise, but as a personal contest of will. Saburo Sakai was the perfect embodiment of this ethos. Driven by a relentless will to be the best, he had achieved the status of an untouchable ace. He and his comrades were utterly convinced of their technical advantage. The numbers supported their confidence. The Zero shock was real. Over the Philippines, they destroyed a high number of American aircraft while suffering minimal losses. The Zero seemed incredibly effective. It had the range of a bomber and the agility of a biplane, a combination that defied conventional wisdom. Allied pilots who tried to fight the Zero on its own terms, who tried to get into a turning dogfight, were at a severe disadvantage. The Zero would quickly gain position, and a burst from its cannons would often disable their plane. The American F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's main fighter, was a tough airplane. Its pilots called it a product of the Grumman Iron Works for a reason. It could absorb significant damage that would make a Zero disintegrate. But it was slower, less nimble, and couldn't climb as well as its Japanese rival. Wildcat pilots learned to survive by developing defensive tactics, like the famous thatch weave, where two friendly fighters would cross paths to lure a pursuer into the wingman's guns. But these were tactics for survival, not for achieving air dominance. They were a way to reduce losses, not to win the sky outright. The uncertainty among Allied pilots was real. They felt like they were fighting in a machine that was fundamentally outclassed. So, the confidence of the Japanese pilots, their laughter at reports of a new, heavier American fighter, wasn't simple foolishness. It was earned from a year of clear aerial dominance. They had every reason to believe the current trend would continue for the Allies. They were wrong. The era of the Zero's dominance was about to end. For the United States Navy, the situation required a swift response. The lesson was clear, and it had been paid for in the experience of their pilots. They needed a new fighter, not just a better one, but one designed with a different tactical purpose. A machine built not to imitate the Zero, but to counter it. The search for a solution didn't start in some sterile design lab. It started with the experienced pilots of the F-4F Wildcat coming back from the front lines. Engineers from Grumman debriefed these pilots consistently. They listened to the accounts of being unable to catch a Zero, of watching it turn quickly. They learned its strengths, but more importantly, they started to catalog its weaknesses. The pilots who survived encounters with the Zero did so by exploiting its few flaws. The Zero couldn't keep up in a high-speed dive. Its controls stiffened up at high speeds, making it less maneuverable. And it was structurally lighter. It lacked pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few good hits from the Wildcat's .50 caliber machine guns could severely damage a Zero. While this invaluable feedback was being gathered, the Americans had a stroke of luck. In June 1942, a Zero flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga had engine trouble during a raid on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. When he tried to make an emergency landing on Akutan Island, his landing gear dug into the soft ground, flipping the plane and tragically resulting in his death. There, in the remote wilderness, lay an almost perfectly intact A-6M-0. The Akutan Zero, as it became known, was an intelligence gold mine. It was carefully taken apart, shipped to the US, and put through exhaustive flight testing. For the first time, American engineers could thoroughly examine their opponent. They confirmed what their pilots had suspected. The Zero was a marvel of lightweight engineering, but it was full of compromises. Armor, pilot protection, robust construction, even good radios, all had been sacrificed for maneuverability and range. What the Japanese saw as a philosophy of perfection, the American engineers at Grumman saw as a critical vulnerability. The blueprint for the Zero's countermeasure was now clear. Leroy Grumman and his team at the Iron Works didn't try to build a better dogfighter. They decided to build a heavyweight fighter. The new machine wouldn't try to outdance the Zero in a turning fight. That was a losing strategy. Instead, it would use raw power, overwhelming firepower, and extreme toughness to dictate the fight. The design, already in the works, was supercharged with this new knowledge. Grumman made a crucial decision. They installed the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower engine. This engine was the heart of the new philosophy. It would give the fighter the power to climb above its enemies and the speed to dive on them, engaging and disengaging at will. This new plane would be heavy, but it was functional weight. It carried hundreds of pounds of armor plating around the cockpit and engine. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without resulting in explosions. And it would carry 6.50 caliber machine guns, a volume of fire that could severely damage a Zero's lighter frame in seconds. The whole concept was a direct answer to the Zero. Where the Zero was light, the Hellcat would be strong. Where the Zero was nimble, the Hellcat would be powerful. Where the Zero sacrificed its pilot for performance, the Hellcat would protect its pilot at all costs. So, you can understand why the Japanese pilots laughed. They were looking at a machine that broke all their rules for what made a great fighter. What they didn't realize was that the Americans weren't just building a new plane. They were creating a whole new rule book for air engagement. When the Grumman F-6F Hellcat started showing up in mid-1943, it was a total contrast to the Zero. Lined up on a carrier deck, it lacked the Zero's delicate grace. It was wide, barrel-chested, and brutally functional. It looked exactly like the heavyweight the Japanese pilots had mocked. But this machine was the product of a different and much more effective school of thought. At its core was that powerhouse engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, churning out over 2,000 horsepower. This power plant was the heart of a whole new combat doctrine. It gave the Hellcat a phenomenal rate of climb and impressive speed, especially at high altitudes where the Zero struggled. This power gave a Hellcat pilot the ultimate advantage, the ability to choose when and where to fight. If things looked difficult, he could simply use his speed to disengage. Wrapped around this engine was an airframe built with classic Grumman toughness. The company's philosophy was simple: build planes that bring their pilots home. The Hellcat was armored with over 200 pounds of plating shielding the pilot and vital systems. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, helping prevent fires. The windscreen was bullet-resistant glass. Pilots would come back in Hellcats that looked heavily damaged, wings shredded, riddled with holes, and live to tell the tale. This survivability wasn't just a morale booster. It meant they kept their most valuable asset, experienced pilots. And those pilots had a significant weapon. The Hellcat carried 6 Browning M 2.50 caliber machine guns, a devastating spray of heavy slugs that could tear a fragile Zero apart in seconds. American pilots were trained to aim for the Zero's wings, where the unprotected fuel tanks were, quickly disabling the nimble fighter. When the first reports on the Hellcat reached Japan, they were met with a mix of disbelief and mockery. The Japanese analysis saw the Hellcat's weight, over 12,000 pounds loaded compared to the Zero's 6,000, and concluded it would be a clumsy aircraft. Their entire doctrine was based on the turning dogfight. By their math, the Hellcat couldn't possibly compete, and they were absolutely right. The Hellcat stood no chance in a turning fight with a Zero. The fatal flaw in their logic was assuming the Hellcat would ever be foolish enough to try. This was all compounded by a massive gap in pilot training. Japan's pool of elite, veteran pilots was being depleted. The rigorous training program that had created men like Saburo Sakai couldn't keep up with the losses. By 1944, new Japanese pilots were being sent to the front, with a tiny fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had. In contrast, the US was turning pilot training into an industrial process. New American naval aviators arrived in the Pacific with 500 to 600 flight hours, many with 200 hours in the Hellcat itself. America wasn't just building a better plane, it was mass-producing better-prepared pilots. The stage was set. The laughter was about to stop. The first major engagements were confusing for the Japanese pilots. When Hellcats saw their first major action in September 1943, the results were a significant shock. The Japanese, expecting a lumbering beast, were met with an unexpected opponent. The Hellcats refused to play their game. Instead, they used a cold, calculated method of engagement: boom and zoom. A Hellcat pilot, using his powerful engine, would climb high above the fight. From there, he'd pick a target, roll over, and plummet downwards, converting altitude into blistering speed. The Zero below often wouldn't see it coming. The Hellcat would scream through the formation in a single devastating pass, its 6.50 calibers engaging for just a split second. Then, using that energy, it would rocket back up to safety to set up another attack. For all its agility, the Zero was at a disadvantage. If it tried to follow the Hellcat in a dive, its controls would stiffen. If it tried to follow in the climb, its weaker engine would leave it a vulnerable target. On top of that, there was the thatch weave. Perfected by Wildcat pilots, this team-based tactic turned the Zero's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. When a Zero got on a Hellcat's tail, its wingman would turn towards it. The targeted pilot would then turn to face his wingman, forcing the Zero to either give up or fly right into the second Hellcat's guns. It was simple, effective, and often overwhelming. The impact hit the Japanese naval air arms hard. Pilots who had been masters of the sky were now facing relentless pressure. Their reports were filled with disbelief. The new American fighter wasn't clumsy. It was brutally fast. It wouldn't turn and fight in a prolonged engagement. It just appeared from above, killed with terrifying efficiency, and vanished. Against the Zero, the Hellcat quickly established a remarkable victory ratio. The psychological impact was immense. This building dread finally culminated on June 19, 1944, a single disastrous day in the history of Japanese naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan launched Operation A-Go, deploying nearly 450 aircraft at the American fleet. It was supposed to be the decisive blow. Instead, it became a heavy defeat. American radar saw them coming from over 100 miles away. Task Force 58 scrambled hundreds of F-6F Hellcats. What happened next was a large-scale engagement. The American pilots, expertly guided by their ship's fighter directors, met the Japanese formations in a perfectly orchestrated defense. The Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced, flew into a wall of lead. The Hellcats, with their advantages in speed, armor, and firepower, prevailed. One American pilot famously said, "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot saw over 300 Japanese planes destroyed on the first day, for the loss of only about 30 American planes. And what of the one-eyed ace who had laughed? Saburo Sakai was no longer a front-line combat pilot. His injuries had left him an instructor. He was stationed on Iwo Jima in June 1944, and he watched as the young men he trained were sent into the intense fighting. He had taught them the art of the dogfight, the skills that made him a legend. Now, he heard the returning pilot's troubled accounts of a blue machine that couldn't be turned, couldn't be caught, and was incredibly robust. The laughter in the operations tent a year earlier had curdled into the bitter realization of a master watching his art become obsolete, and his students sent into impossible battles. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot might have been the Hellcat's most significant achievement, but its job wasn't done. For the rest of the war, it was the dominant American fighter in the Pacific sky. The final numbers are remarkable. Over its 2 years of primary combat service, the F-6F Hellcat was credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft in U.S. and British service. This accounted for 56% of all U.S. Navy and Marine air-to-air victories in the entire war. Against those thousands of victories, only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat. This resulted in an incredible overall victory-to-loss ratio, often cited as 19-1. The plane earned a new nickname, the Ace Maker. An astounding 305 U.S. Navy pilots became aces flying the Hellcat, more than in any other American fighter. Men like Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, became legends at its controls. The Hellcat wasn't just a powerful machine, it was forgiving, a stable gun platform, and above all, it brought its pilots home, allowing them to gain experience and become even more formidable. For Japan, the consequences were profound. The loss of veteran pilots had become an unrecoverable drain. By the end of the war, the pre-war cadre of elite, combat-experienced pilots had been practically wiped out. This eventually led to Japan's most desperate tactic, the kamikaze attacks. The rise of organized suicide attacks was the ultimate admission of conventional defeat in the air. When your pilots can no longer survive an encounter with the enemy, the ultimate strategy becomes using the pilot himself as the weapon. The kamikaze was the tragic final act for an air force that had been dismantled by the Hellcat and the industrial system it represented. Years after the war, Saburo Sakai, the ace who survived, reflected on the conflict. He never lost respect for his beloved Zero, seeing it as a purer expression of aerial combat. But he had come to understand a brutal truth. The Zero was the better fighter, he reportedly said, but the Hellcat was the better weapon system. There's another poignant quote, often attributed to Sakai, that sums it all up. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to spare them. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at the mercy of your enemy. Whether he said those exact words or not, the sentiment captures the harsh reality. Japan had brought a beautifully crafted weapon to a technologically advanced conflict. They believed they were samurai. The Hellcat proved they were simply men with outdated weapons, facing the future. So, the story of the Hellcat versus the Zero is really more than a tale of two planes. It's the story of two philosophies of war colliding in mid-air. One, the Japanese philosophy, was based on individual skill, agility, and a warrior's spirit, a belief that the man could overcome any material disadvantage. The other, the American philosophy, was one of systems, overwhelming force, industrial-scale production, and above all, prioritizing the survival of the operator. The F-6F Hellcat was the perfect symbol of that American philosophy. It wasn't designed to win duels, it was designed to win a war. It was heavy because it carried the weight of armor, a powerful engine, and a doctrine that valued a pilot's life. The Japanese pilots laughed because they couldn't see past the weight. They couldn't understand that every extra pound on the Hellcat represented not a weakness, but a piece of a comprehensive weapon system, a system of radar direction, coordinated tactics, superior training, and industrial might that they just couldn't match. By the time the laughter stopped, Japan's air forces had effectively been marginalized. The plane they mocked hadn't just defeated their legendary Zero, it had rendered its entire reason for being obsolete. The one-eyed ace, Saburo Sakai, survived to see the peace, a living monument to an era of air combat that had vanished in the face of industrial precision. The Hellcat had proven that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't always the sharpest sword, but the most robust and relentless tool. If you enjoyed this story of how technology and strategy turned the tide of the Pacific Air War, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more military history deep dives. And tell us in the comments, what other iconic matchups should we cover next? Thanks for watching.